Hey everyone! First of all, a huge thank you to all of you. We've finally hit 100 subscribers. This wouldn't have been possible without your amazing support. To celebrate, I'm starting a special series designed to help you relax and fall asleep peacefully. So get comfortable, put on your headphones, and get ready for a chilling journey. Let's begin. The forest was darker than I remembered. The trees, once towering sentinels of my childhood adventures, seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at the sky. I stood at the edge of the campsite, the same one where my family had pitched tents decades ago. But something was different now, something I couldn't quite place. As a child, I had loved the woods. They were my sanctuary, my escape from the noise of the world. But that one night, I heard something. Voices carried on the wind, faint and indistinct. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the murmurs of my parents, talking quietly by the campfire. But when I ventured into the forest, drawn by the sound, I found no one. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence of the wood. Now, standing here as an adult, the memory of those whispers gnawed at me. I hadn't thought about them in years, but lately they'd been creeping into my dreams. Each night I'd hear the same low murmurs, words I couldn't make out, but felt compelled to follow. When I woke up, the urge to return to the campsite was overwhelming, as if the woods themselves were calling me back. I walked into the clearing, the crunch of leaves under my boots echoing in the quiet. The fire pit was still there, a circle of blackened stones surrounded by ash. It looked untouched, as if no time had passed. My breath caught when I saw something else. A small, rusted tin box, half buried in the dirt. I knelt and pried it open, my hands trembling. Inside was a faded Polaroid of me as a child, standing by the fire pit, grinning with my arms outstretched. I didn't remember this photo being taken. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The campfire crackled, sending sparks into the air. But the shadows seemed too deep, too alive. The sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, felt muted, as though the woods were holding their breath. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it, a faint, whispering sound carried on the wind. It wasn't the trees or the wind itself, it was voices. I froze, straining to listen. The words were indistinct, like a conversation heard through a thick wall, but they had a rhythm, a cadence that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped toward the edge of the clearing. The voices grew louder, still impossible to understand, but undeniably human. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The voices stopped. My heart thundered in my chest as I scanned the trees with the flashlight. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of trunks and undergrowth. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard my own voice echo from deeper in the woods, repeating the same question. "Hello? Is someone there?" The next morning, I convinced myself it was exhaustion, maybe an overactive imagination. But the whispers returned the following night, louder this time. They mimicked everything I said, each word warped and distorted, as if spoken by something that didn't fully understand human speech. I spent the next day exploring the area, hoping to find some rational explanation. That's when I found the cabin. It wasn't on any map, and it looked abandoned. Its roof sagged, and vines crawled up its walls. But when I pushed open the door, it was as if I'd stepped into a nightmare. The cabin was filled with journals, hundreds of them, stacked on shelves and scattered across the floor. Each one was identical, with a plain black cover and no title. I picked one up and opened it. My hand shook as I read the first page. It described my first night back at the campsite in excruciating detail. The fire pit, the photo, the whispers. Every word, every thought I'd had was written down as if someone had been inside my head. The next journal picked up where the first left off, detailing the second night, and the voices mimicking. As I flipped through, the handwriting changed. It became more erratic, more frantic, and the entries grew darker. They described events that hadn't happened yet. Terrible things, impossible things. I spent hours reading, losing track of time, until the sunlight streaming through the cracked windows turned orange, then red. As night fell, the whispers began again, this time inside the cabin. They were louder now, overlapping and chaotic, filling the air with a cacophony of distorted voices. I stumbled out of the cabin, clutching one of the journals, and ran back to the campsite. But the whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the fire pit, I could barely hear my own thoughts over the noise. That's when I saw them, shadows moving between the trees, too fast and too fluid to be human. Their shapes were indistinct, like figures half-formed from smoke, but their eyes burned like embers. They surrounded the clearing, whispering in perfect unison, their words no longer gibberish. "You were always meant to return," they said. The fire died, leaving me in complete darkness. The shadows closed in, their whispers becoming screams, and I felt myself being pulled into the earth, into the forest, into something vast and unknowable. The next morning, the campsite was empty. All that remained was the journal I had taken from the cabin, lying open by the fire pit. The last entry was in my handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. You can't leave. This is where you belong. Driving home late at night, the empty stretch of road felt suffocating. The only sounds were the hum of my car engine, the faint crackle of static from the old radio. I hated driving at night, but work had kept me late, and now all I wanted was to get home, shower, and collapse into bed. The highway was eerily empty. No headlights behind me, no taillights ahead, just endless asphalt stretching into the darkness. My eyelids were growing heavy when I saw a figure up ahead, standing on the shoulder of the road, their thumb raised in the universal signal for help. I should have driven past. Every horror story I'd ever heard screamed at me to keep going, but something about the way they stood there, shoulders slumped and head bowed, made me slow down. Maybe it was guilt. Leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me. I pulled over, rolling down the passenger window just a crack. "You need a ride?" The hitchhiker nodded without looking up. "Where you headed?" "Just down the road," they said, their voice soft but hollow. "Anywhere is fine." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. The hitchhiker climbed in, their movements slow and deliberate. They wore a dark hoodie that obscured their face, and they didn't bother to pull the hood down. We drove in silence for a while. The air felt heavier with them in the car, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every few minutes, I glanced at them from the corner of my eye, but they just stared straight ahead, unmoving. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "So, where exactly do you need to go?" They turned to me, and I nearly swerved off the road. Their face was pale, too pale, like they hadn't seen sunlight in years. Their eyes were sunken, dark hollows that seemed to stare straight through me. But it was their smile that sent chills racing down my spine. Too wide, too forced, as if they weren't used to the expression. "Just keep driving," they said. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to steady my breathing. "What's your name?" They didn't answer. Instead, they leaned forward and turned off the radio. The car was plunged into an oppressive silence, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the road. After what felt like an eternity, they spoke again. "You shouldn't have stopped." I glanced at them, my heart pounding. "What?" "You shouldn't have stopped," they repeated, their voice lower now, almost a growl. I pressed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to get to the next town or gas station or anywhere with people. But the road stretched on endlessly, no signs, no exits. That's when I noticed something. The hitchhiker's reflection in the rearview mirror, there wasn't one. My stomach dropped. I glanced over at them, and for the first time, they were looking at me. Their eyes were no longer hollow. They burned with an unnatural light, like twin flames. "You can't outrun it," they said. "No one ever does." I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. When I turned to tell them to get out, the seat was empty. The hitchhiker was gone. My hands shook as I sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I saw it. A bloody handprint smeared on the inside of the passenger window. I didn't wait to analyze it. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road, desperate to leave that stretch of highway behind. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. By the time I reached my driveway, I was trembling. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. The handprint on the window was gone. I stepped out and made my way to the front door. Just as I reached for my keys, I heard it, a faint, familiar voice coming from the shadows. "You shouldn't have stopped." I spun around, but no one was there. My porch light flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the yard. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind made my heart race. And when I finally did drift off, I dreamed of the hitchhiker's face, their burning eyes, and that too wide smile. The next morning, I found a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "You'll see me again." Since that night, I've avoided driving after dark. But sometimes, when I'm out late, I swear I see someone standing on the side of the road, their thumb raised, waiting. When I first stepped into my new house, it felt like a fresh start, the kind of place where life could finally fall into place. It was an old two-story Victorian with creaky floors, high ceilings, and windows that let in just enough light to give the place a warm, lived-in feel. The house had character, as the realtor put it, and it was everything I could afford on my modest budget. Unpacking took the better part of a week, but I enjoyed every moment of it. Each room felt like a blank slate, ready to be filled with my memory. By the 7th day, I had everything where I wanted it, save for a few boxes I had shoved into a small storage closet under the stairs. I didn't think much about that closet at first. It was narrow and unremarkable, good for little more than storing junk. It was the 9th day when I found the door. I'd been organizing some old books in the hallway when I dropped one, and it slid along the wooden floor, coming to rest against the base of the wall near the closet. When I bent down to retrieve it, I noticed something odd. The wall just past the closet door didn't line up properly. It jutted out slightly like it was hiding something. Curious, I ran my hand along the surface and felt a faint seam beneath the wallpaper. My pulse quickened. It didn't feel like part of the house's original structure. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, I carefully peeled back the wallpaper, revealing a small hidden door. It was painted the same color as the wall, camouflaged perfectly. The doorknob was old and rusted, and when I turned it, the door creaked open with an agonizing groan. Beyond the door was a room I hadn't seen on the floor plan. The air inside was stale and heavy, as if it had been sealed off for years. The room was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet, with a single window covered in grime. Dust coated every surface, and the only thing in the room was a wooden chair sitting in the center. Something about it made my skin crawl. At first, I thought the room was a curiosity, an odd little quirk of the house. But as I stood there staring at the chair, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The air felt colder too, biting against my skin. I backed out of the room and closed the door, telling myself I'd deal with it later. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking of it. The chair, the stale air, the way the room seemed to press in on me. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a faint sound, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. It was coming from downstairs. I crept down the staircase, my heart pounding in my ears. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, humming with tension. The tapping grew louder as I approached the hidden door. When I opened it, the room was exactly as I'd left it. The chair sat in the center, untouched, but now the window was clean, allowing a sliver of moonlight to spill inside. And then I saw it. Carved into the chair's wooden surface were 2 words: sit down. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. Something wasn't right about that room, something I couldn't explain. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was some elaborate prank, maybe from the previous owner, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I tried to ignore the door, focusing instead on cleaning the rest of the house. But no matter how much I busied myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, things only got worse. I'd hear the door creaking open at odd hours, though I knew I'd locked it. I'd find objects moved to strange places, like my keys sitting on the chair inside the room. And then came the dreams. Each night I dreamed of the room. In the dream, I was sitting in the chair, unable to move. Shadows danced along the walls, whispering my name in voices that sounded both familiar and alien. The window would open, and something would crawl inside, something that never fully revealed itself, but its presence filled me with paralyzing fear. The worst part was waking up and finding that the door to the room was always open. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to record myself sleeping. I set up my phone to capture everything, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The next morning, I hesitated to watch the footage, but I forced myself to press play. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I tossed and turned, the occasional creak of the house breaking the silence. But then, around 2:37 a.m., the door to my bedroom opened slowly. A figure stepped inside. It wasn't me. The figure was indistinct, its features blurred like a smudged photograph. It moved to the foot of my bed and just stood there, watching me. After a few minutes, it turned and walked out of the room. The video ended with a faint whisper that sent chills down my spine. Come back to the chair. I couldn't stay in the house after. I packed a bag and left, spending the night at a motel. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had the door to the hidden room sealed shut, but the dreams haven't stopped. Every night, I'm back in that room, sitting in that chair, unable to escape. And when I wake up, I always find the same words written somewhere nearby, no matter where I am. You can't seal what's already open. I've always been a night owl. My job as a freelance writer often meant working late into the night, the world outside quiet and still while I tapped away on my keyboard. It was peaceful and a little lonely. That was why, when I first started hearing the tapping, I thought it was nothing, just the house settling or the wind knocking against the windows. It started small, faint, rhythmic taps that I could barely hear over the hum of my laptop. They seemed to come from the direction of my bedroom, but when I went to check, there was nothing. No open window, no tree branches brushing against the walls, just the empty room, bathed in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. That night, as I lay in bed, the tapping returned. It was louder now, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood of the closet door. I stared at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. My heart raced, and when I finally worked up the courage to check, I opened the closet door to find nothing. just my clothes neatly, and a few storage boxes stacked in the corner. I laughed at myself for being paranoid and went back to bed, but the tapping didn't stop. Over the next few nights, it grew louder and more persistent. Always the same pattern. 3 quick taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I started leaving the closet door open, thinking that maybe whatever was causing the sound would stop if there was no barrier. It didn't. One night, as I sat at my desk in the living room, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the bedroom. It was coming from the window right behind me. My breath caught in my throat. The window overlooked the backyard, and there was nothing back there but a fence and a few scraggly bushes. Slowly, I turned to look. The blinds were closed, but the tapping continued, now louder and more insistent. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was an animal, a bird, or a stray cat. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The taps were too precise, too deliberate. I stood, my legs trembling, and approached the window. With one quick motion, I yanked the blinds open. Nothing. The backyard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the bushes swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of anything that could have made the sound. Relieved and slightly embarrassed, I went back to work, convincing myself that I was just imagining things. But as I sat down, I noticed something on the glass, a faint smudge, like the outline of a hand. That night, the tapping came from everywhere. The windows, the walls, even the floor beneath my bed. It was as if the house itself was alive, its hollow frame filled with restless energy. Desperate for answers, I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I bought a cheap recording device and left it running overnight in my bedroom. When I played it back the next morning, my stomach twisted. The recording captured the tapping, clear and sharp, but it also captured something else. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, and it was saying my name. Michael, Michael. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands shook as I replayed the recording, over and over, hoping I'd misheard. But the voice was there every time, soft, insistent, as if it were trying to draw me closer. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, every light in the house on, clutching the heaviest flashlight I owned like a weapon. The tapping started around 2 a.m., but this time I didn't run. I forced myself to listen, to try and understand. The taps came in the same pattern as always. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Slowly, the realization dawned on me. It was Morse code. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and searched for a Morse code translator. As I tapped the sequence into the app, a single word appeared on the screen. Open. I stared at the word, my mind racing. Open what? The closet? The window? Then it hit me. The attic. The entrance to the attic was a small hatch in the hallway ceiling. I'd never been up there, mostly because I didn't have a ladder. But now, I felt compelled. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to move. I dragged a chair from the kitchen and stood on it, pushing the hatch open. A cold draft hit me as I pulled myself up into the attic. The space was dark, the only light coming from the flashlight in my hand. As I swept the beam across the dusty floor, I saw it, a small wooden box sitting in the corner. It looked ancient, its surface scratched and worn. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a photograph, black and white, of a young boy standing in front of a house, my house. Written on the back of the photo were 2 words, help me. That's when I heard it, a voice, clear and desperate, echoing in the attic. Michael, please, help me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The voice was coming from the box. I don't know how I made it out of the attic, but I slammed the hatch shut and fled the house that night. I haven't been back since. I don't know who the boy in the photograph was or what he wanted, but I can still hear him sometimes, whispering my name in the dead of night. It was the first time I'd ever taken the night shift at the diner. I'd only been working there for a few weeks, mostly mornings and afternoons, and the older servers always whispered about how the night shift was different. I thought they were just trying to scare the new girl. The place was small, one of those classic roadside diners with red leather booths and a long counter lined with bar stools. It was the kind of place that stayed open 24/7, catching truckers, travelers, and the occasional insomniac. Most nights, it was dead quiet by midnight. That night was no different. By 2 a.m., the only sound was the buzz of the neon open sign and the occasional clink of my coffee pot against the counter. I was alone. Tony, the cook, had left early because of a family emergency, and my manager had assured me it would be a slow night. I was refilling the ketchup bottles when the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, tall and wiry, his face hidden under the brim of a wide hat. He didn't say anything as he slid into the booth in the far corner, the one partially hidden by the shadow of the jukebox. "Good evening," I called, grabbing my notepad. "Coffee to start?" He nodded, his face still obscured. His hands, though, were pale and bony, his fingers twitching slightly as they rested on the table. I poured him a cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. He didn't thank me, just stared into the steaming liquid like it held some kind of answer. "Do you want a menu, or do you already know what you'd like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He looked up then, and I felt a chill run through me. His eyes were dark, too dark, like twin voids. His lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came out. After a moment, he shook his head. "Okay," I said, backing away. "Let me know if you need anything." I busied myself behind the counter, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But every time I glanced at the corner booth, the man was staring at me. Not his coffee, not the jukebox, me. Around 2:30 a.m., the door jingled again. A woman entered, her face pale and drawn, her clothes disheveled as if she'd been running. She glanced around nervously before rushing over to the counter. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is there a back door?" I frowned. "Yeah, in the kitchen. Are you okay?" She didn't answer. Her eyes darted to the corner booth, and her face turned ashen. "You need to leave," she said, her voice barely audible. I blinked. "What?" She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "That man, he's not human." I laughed nervously, pulling my arm away. "What are you talking about? He's just a customer." She shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "He's been following me. He appears out of nowhere, always in the shadows, always watching. Please, you have to believe me." Before I could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. My heart sank as I turned to see who had entered. It was another man, dressed similarly to the one in the booth. His hat was tipped low, and his face was eerily pale. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge anyone. He simply sat at the counter, his eyes fixed on the woman. She gasped, backing away. "Number, no, no, no." I looked from her to the two men, confusion and fear bubbling inside me. "What's going on?" "They're here for me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But they'll take you too if you don't run." The man at the counter turned to me, his movements slow and deliberate. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. It was like staring into something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. The lights in the diner flickered, and the air grew icy. The woman grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the kitchen. "We have to go, now." I hesitated, my eyes darting to the corner booth. The first man was still sitting there, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck bending in a way that made my stomach churn. That was all the convincing I needed. I followed the woman into the kitchen, my breath coming in short gasps. "What do they want?" I asked as we reached the back door. "They collect souls," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're not alive. They're not dead. They just exist. And once they've seen you, they don't stop until they take you." I shoved the back door open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. We ran, the diner shrinking behind us, the lights flickering ominously in the distance. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, I turned to her. "What do we do now?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared past me, her face frozen in horror. I turned slowly, my heart hammering. The two men stood there, their dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched us, unblinking, and then they smiled. Wide, inhuman smiles that stretched far too long. The last thing I remember is their hands, cold and unyielding as they reached for me. I grew up in a quiet little town where nothing much happened. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and people didn't lock their doors at night. The woods surrounding the town were a popular hangout spot for kids, sprawling, dense, and full of hidden trails. But there was one place no one ever went, Shadow Hollow. Shadow Hollow was a small clearing deep in the forest, surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to block out the sunlight no matter the time of day. The older kids told stories about it, saying it was cursed, but no one really knew why. All I knew was that it gave me the creeps. One fall evening, my best friend Claire dared me to go there. "It's just a bunch of trees," she said, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Come on, we'll go together. Don't tell me you're scared." I didn't want to look like a coward, so I agreed. We grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods just before sunset. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to change. The usual chirping of birds and rustling leaves gave way to an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving the trees unnaturally still. After about 20 minutes of walking, we found the clearing. The stories didn't do it justice. The trees around Shadow Hollow were gnarled and blackened, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Claire laughed nervously. "See? Nothing to it. Just a spooky old clearing." She stepped into the center, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "I told you there was nothing to..." Her words cut off abruptly as the beam of her flashlight flickered and went out. "Claire," I called, stepping closer. She didn't respond. She stood completely still, her back to me, her head tilted as if she were listening to something. "Claire, stop messing around," I said, my voice trembling. When she finally turned to face me, her expression made my blood run cold. Her eyes were wide and vacant, and her mouth was slightly open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. "What's wrong?" I whispered, my flashlight shaking in my hand. She pointed behind me. I froze. My body felt like it was made of lead, but I forced myself to turn around. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body shrouded in darkness. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was pale and featureless, except for two deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if the world itself were bending. I grabbed Claire's arm. "We're leaving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't resist as I pulled her toward the trail, but she kept looking over her shoulder, her vacant eyes locked on the figure. As we ran, the silence of the woods was broken by a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the forest. By the time we got back to town, Claire was pale and shaking, her hands icy cold. She wouldn't talk about what happened, no matter how much I pressed her. She just kept saying, "We shouldn't have gone there." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the clearing, its hollow eyes staring at me. The next morning, I went to check on Claire. Her mom said she hadn't come out of her room all night. When I went upstairs, I found her sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the window. "Claire, are you okay?" I asked gently. She didn't answer. She just pointed at the window. I followed her gaze, and my heart stopped. There, standing just outside the tree line, was the figure. It didn't move. It just watched. I called Claire's mom, and we stayed with her all day, but the figure didn't leave. By nightfall, it was gone, but Claire wasn't the same after that. She started sleepwalking, always heading toward the woods. We had to lock her bedroom door at night to keep her from leaving. And then, one night, she was gone. The door to her room was wide open, the lock broken. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. The only thing we found was her flashlight, lying at the edge of Shadow Hollow. I've never gone back to the woods, but sometimes, late at night, I see something in the distance, a tall, thin figure standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. It was the middle of a bitter winter when I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. The place had been abandoned for years, the paint peeling from the walls and the wood of the porch creaking underfoot, but the rent was cheap and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. I didn't expect much, just a quiet place to write, away from distractions. The first night I arrived, everything seemed fine. The house was cold, but I lit a fire in the living room and settled in with a book, feeling comfortable for the first time in weeks. There was a strange stillness to the place, as if the house was holding its breath. But I chalked it up to the isolation, no neighbors for miles, just trees and snow. It wasn't until the second night that things began to feel off. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I lay frozen in the darkness, my heart racing. I got up to check, pulling the curtains aside. There was nothing outside, just the moonlight reflecting off the snow. But the tapping continued, louder now, coming from the other side of the room. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping was coming from the closet. My mind raced. There had been no one in the house when I moved, and I had locked every door and window. With shaking hands, I opened the closet door, but there was nothing there. Just old boxes and a dusty coat hanging from a hook. I shut the door quickly, my heart still pounding in my chest. But as I climbed back into bed, the tapping stopped. I lay there in the darkness, straining to hear anything. The house was silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I went into town to pick up some groceries. The old woman at the corner store seemed to recognize me as soon as I walked in. "You're staying at the old Martin place, aren't you?" she asked, her voice thick with curiosity. I nodded, picking up a loaf of bread. "Yeah, I just moved in." Her face darkened and she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You're not the first to stay there. It's been empty for years for a reason." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before speaking again, her eyes darting around the shop, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "The Martins, they vanished one winter, years ago. No one knows what happened to them. But there's something about that house. It doesn't let go of people. It gets inside their heads, makes them do things. People who live there, well, they don't last long." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off as superstition. After all, it was just an old farmhouse. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. That night, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. But as the darkness crept in, the tapping began. At first, it was light, almost like the sound of nails against glass. But then it grew louder, more insistent, until it became a frantic knocking. It wasn't coming from the window or the closet this time. It was coming from inside the walls. I jumped out of bed, my pulse hammering in my ears, and rushed to the living room. The tapping was getting louder, faster, as if something was scratching its way through the very foundation of the house. I could feel the walls vibrating, a deep, low hum, like the house itself was alive. I grabbed a flashlight and began inspecting the walls, desperate to find the source of the sound. But no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find anything. The house was still. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. The sound continued for hours, never stopping, always louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, pacing the floor, my mind racing with thoughts of the old woman's warning. But by morning, the house was quiet again, and I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things, planning to find somewhere else to stay. But as I turned to leave, I saw it, a figure standing in the window, staring out into the snow. My blood ran cold. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the glass, but I could feel its eyes on me. I rushed to the door and yanked it open, but when I stepped outside, there was no one there, just the empty landscape, the snow falling gently to the ground. I tried to leave that day, but something kept pulling me back. Every time I attempted to drive away, my car wouldn't start, as if the house itself was holding me in place. By the third attempt, I realized I was trapped. The tapping returned, now louder than ever, echoing through every room of the house. It was like the walls were closing in, the sound becoming a rhythmic pounding that drowned out everything else. The following night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. Soft, deliberate steps. The kind of footsteps you make when you're trying not to be heard. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened as the steps moved closer, the door creaking open slowly. Then, a voice, low and guttural, whispered my name. Come with me. The voice was familiar, though I couldn't place it. I looked toward the door, but it was empty. The house was silent, as if nothing had happened. But when I turned around, I saw her, Claire, my sister, standing in the corner of the room, her eyes wide and unblinking. Claire, I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the window, and there outside was the figure again, tall and shadowed, just beyond the glass, watching. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the house had already claimed me. I'd never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I was always the skeptical one, the one who rolled their eyes at stories of haunted houses and restless spirits. That was until I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom unit in an old building on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and I needed a place to stay while I finished up my degree. Little did I know this apartment would soon become a place where I would question everything I thought I knew about the world. It all started on my first night. The apartment was old, creaky floors, drafty windows, and a faint smell of mildew in the air. But it was also quiet, peaceful, and perfect for someone who liked solitude. I spent the first few hours unpacking, setting up my things, and getting acquainted with the place. As the evening went on, I sat down on the couch to relax with a book. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of the wind outside were the only sounds breaking the silence. But then, around midnight, I heard it, a soft whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe the pipes or even the old wood settling. But the whisper was unmistakable. It was coming from the hallway, just beyond the living room. I got up cautiously, my breath shallow, and walked to the doorway. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the faint glow from the kitchen, but I could still hear it, the whispering. It wasn't words I could make out, just a soft, unintelligible murmur. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that I'd been hearing things. I went back to the couch, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct, like someone was just out of sight, speaking softly in the dark. I decided to ignore it, telling myself again that it was just the house settling. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering continued, rising and falling in volume, like it was trying to get my attention. I pulled the blankets over my head, pressing my hands to my ears, but it wouldn't stop. When morning finally came, I went about my day, dismissing the experience as a result of stress. I had a lot on my plate with schoolwork, and it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the night came again, so did the whisper. By the third night, the whispers had turned into full sentences. I could hear a voice, soft but clear, calling my name, whispering it like a soft breath in my ear. I was no longer sure it was just my imagination. That night, I decided to confront it. I stood up from the couch, my heart hammering in my chest, and walked into the hallway. The air felt colder, heavier, as I reached the end of the hallway, where a door led to an old storage closet. I hadn't thought much of the closet before. It was small, cluttered with old boxes, unused furniture, but it was always locked. The whispering was louder now, almost frantic. As I reached the closet, I could hear my name being called, pleading, desperate. With trembling hands, I turned the handle and pulled the door open. Inside was nothing but dust and old, unused furniture, except for one thing, an old photograph lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the cracked glass. The photo was in black and white, faded with it, and it showed a family, 2 adults and a small child, standing together in front of an old house. The faces were blurry, but I could make out the eyes. They were dark, almost hollow, and they seemed to stare back at me, unblinking from the photo. Suddenly, I felt cold fingers brush against my neck, and I spun around in panic. But no one was there. The whispering had stopped. I was breathing heavily, trying to calm myself, but there was something wrong. The room seemed darker, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from... I ran back to the couch, but as I looked around, the apartment was different. The air felt thick, oppressive. I turned to the front door, only to find it had closed it, the lock clicking shut with a soft snick. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I heard the voice again, this time, clearer than ever. It was no longer a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the dark corners of the room. Leave, before it's too late. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath in the air. Then, a figure appeared in the doorway of the hallway. It was a woman, tall, with long, disheveled hair. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark. Her clothes were ragged, as if they had been torn and weathered by years of neglect. She stood in the doorway, staring at me with an eerie, empty gaze. "Leave now," she said again, her voice raspy and hoarse. "Leave before it takes you." I couldn't move, my legs frozen in fear. She stepped forward, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, but I couldn't look away from her eyes. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The room was silent again, but I could still feel her presence, lingering in the air, watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty hallway, waiting for something else to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was waiting, something was watching. By morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the rent or the lease or the fact that I didn't have anywhere else to go. I just needed to leave that apartment. I haven't been back since. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I can still hear the whispers, still feel the cold touch on my neck, and I can't help but wonder if whatever was in that apartment is still waiting, still watching for the next person. It was the end of autumn when I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house had been empty for years, and the landlord had promised it was just waiting for someone to bring it back to life. The rent was incredibly cheap, and after a long stretch of searching for affordable housing, I jumped at the opportunity. Little did I know, the house came with more than just the promise of peace and quiet. The first night was uneventful. The house creaked with the sounds of an old building settling, and the wind howled outside, but nothing that set off any alarm bells. It was cold, and the heat didn't work as well as I hoped, but I figured I'd deal with that later. I unpacked what little I had, then went to bed early, eager to start fresh in a new place. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things. It started with the lights flickering. At first, I thought it was a problem with the electrical wiring, but it wasn't just the lights. It was the whole house. The way the shadows seemed to move unnaturally, like something was lurking just out of sight. At night, the silence was broken by creaking footsteps above my bedroom, though I lived alone and hadn't been up there. One evening, as I sat on the couch, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at me, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone knocking on the door. 3 sharp raps. I froze, staring at the door, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But then the knock came. I stood up, walking slowly toward the door, my pulse quickening. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. I opened the door a crack, but the porch was empty. The only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. That night, the knocking, but this time, it didn't stop. It came every hour on the hour, each time growing louder and more insistent, as if someone or something was desperate to be let in. I stayed up all night, my eyes wide open, staring at the door, terrified of what might be on the other side. But there was nothing. No one ever came through the door. No one ever knocked again. But the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching me, never left. One night, after a particularly loud knock, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside to investigate. I walked around the house, scanning the shadows, but found nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No signs of anyone being there. But then I noticed something strange. The barn, which I had avoided since moving in, was slightly open. I hadn't gone near it before, mainly because it looked like it hadn't been used in years. But now, the door was ajar, as if inviting me inside. I walked toward it slowly, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open. The barn smelled musty and damp, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I shined my flashlight across the interior, revealing old, forgotten farm equipment and piles of straw. But at the far end of the barn, in the deepest shadows, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing still, its back to me. I froze, too terrified to move, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't turn around, but I could feel it, watching me. Slowly, I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. The door slammed shut behind me. I ran back to the house, heart pounding in my chest, and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called the landlord, asking about the history of the house. I needed to know what I was dealing with. What had I gotten myself into? The landlord didn't seem surprised by my question. "You're not the first to be unsettled," he said, his voice low. "The house has a history of strange occurrences. It's been abandoned and forgotten for a reason." He didn't tell me much more, only that the house had been built nearly a century ago. And over the years, there had been strange stories about it. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, and eerie sightings. But it wasn't until I asked about the barn that he went silent. "The barn," he finally said, his voice shaking, "was where they found her." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The woman. She disappeared all those years ago. They say she was killed by something in the house. Something that still lingers. No one really talks about it, but there are stories." The next night, the knocking began again. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight, and with my heart pounding in my chest, I went back outside. But the barn was different. This time, the door was wide open as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside again, my mind racing with the knowledge that something was wrong. Something was waiting. I walked to the back of the barn, where the shadows were thickest, and there, I saw it again. The figure. It was still unmoving, but this time, I could see its face. It was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing a row of sharp, yellowed teeth. Before I could react, it lunged forward, but I was already running. The barn door slammed shut behind me as I sprinted toward the house, my breath ragged, my legs burning with fear. But when I turned to look back, there was nothing. No figure, no sound. I locked myself inside the house once again, trembling in terror. But that night, the knocking came louder than ever, accompanied by a soft voice whispering through the walls. "Let me in." I've tried to leave. I've tried everything, but no matter where I go, the knocking follows. And sometimes, in the dark, I feel its cold breath on my neck. I know now that the house will never let me go. It knows I'm here, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a short escape from the chaos of city life. I had found a secluded cabin in the woods, an isolated little retreat to recharge and enjoy the tranquility of nature. It was advertised as a cozy, rustic cabin, with all the comforts of home, the perfect place to unwind. I booked it without a second thought. The drive to the cabin was longer than expected. As I navigated the winding roads, I found myself farther and farther from civilization. The trees grew denser, the air heavier, and the road became rougher. It was the kind of place where you could almost forget the world existed. As I arrived at the cabin, the setting sun cast long shadows over the landscape, and the air felt cool and crisp. The cabin itself looked charming enough, old but well kept, nestled at the edge of a dense forest. I settled in and unpacked, eager to explore the area. The silence of the woods was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, but it was strangely comforting. I spent the first few hours walking along the trails nearby, taking in the beauty of everything seemed perfect. That is, until night fell. As darkness enveloped the woods, the atmosphere around the cabin began to shift. The air grew heavy, the silence was suffocating, and the faintest rustling of leaves seemed amplified in the stillness. I sat down by the small fireplace, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. It started with small noises, footsteps outside, branches scraping against the cabin's walls. I told myself it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The darkness seemed to press in closer, and the only light came from the flickering fire. I tried to ignore it, pulling a blanket tighter around myself and settling into the couch. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from somewhere near the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively moved toward the door to check outside. But when I opened it, nothing was there, just the vast, empty woods, silent and still. My breath came in short bursts as I slammed the door shut, bolting it behind me. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something scratching at the walls. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, determined to see what was causing the noise. The woods were thick and dark, the flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. I called out, hoping to find an animal or something explainable, but all I heard was the sound of my own voice echoing back. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it stood perfectly still, facing away from me. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague silhouette in the dark. I felt an icy chill rush over me as I stared at it. My body froze, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The figure moved, slowly at first, then faster, jerking and twitching unnaturally as it closed the distance between us. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand, unable to look away. The thing's movements were erratic, unnatural, as if it didn't belong in me. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my pulse racing. I locked the door behind me, but the feeling of being hunted didn't leave. The growling had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a whispering, faint but insistent. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the walls. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was getting closer. I backed away from the door, terrified. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, until it was a deafening cacophony in my mind. It was as if the very walls of the cabin were speaking to me, but in a language I couldn't understand. Then, the whisper stopped. The silence was deafening, and that's when I saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly, peering at me from the shadows near the fireplace. They were human eyes, but the pupils were completely dilated, the gaze empty, soulless. I backed away, my legs trembling, my heart hammering in my chest. The eyes followed me, unblinking, moving closer with each step I took. I couldn't scream, couldn't make a sound. I felt trapped, unable to escape this nightmare. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the window. I spun around, nearly falling over in my panic. Outside, standing in the dark, was the figure, now much closer, its face obscured in shadow, but I could still see its eyes, and it was smiling. A grin stretched unnaturally wide, showing sharp, jagged teeth. I slammed the blinds shut, my breath coming in desperate gasps. The figure was still there, waiting, watching. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the feeling of being suffocated by the darkness and the terror of that smile was unbearable. Eventually, I couldn't stay in the cabin any. I grabbed my things and ran into the woods, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to get away. I stumbled through the trees, my legs weak and my mind racing, but no matter how far I ran, the figure followed. It was always just behind me, always watching, always smiling that awful grin. By the time I reached the road, I was shaking uncontrollably, barely able to stand. A car pulled up, the driver looking at me with concern. I climbed in, barely able to explain what had happened. All I could say was that I needed to get out of the woods, away from that place. As we drove away, I looked back. The cabin, the woods, the figure, that they were gone. But the terror still clung to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching. I never went back to the cabin, and I never will. I don't know what was in those, but I do know one thing. There are things out there that don't belong in this world, and they don't stop hunting until they find you. It had been a long, exhausting week. The city was suffocating, and I needed a break. My friend Tom had invited me to stay at his family's cabin in the mountains for the weekend. He promised it would be a peaceful retreat, a chance to clear my head. I'd heard strange rumors about the place, but I shrugged them off as mere superstition. Who wouldn't be excited about a cabin in the mountain? The drive took hours, the winding roads and dense trees making everything feel isolated. As I finally reached the cabin, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. The cabin itself was charming, nestled between towering pine trees, the kind of place you see in travel brochures. Tom greeted me at the door with a grin, his excitement evident. We spent the first night catching up, cooking dinner, and relaxing by the fireplace. The crackling of the logs and the occasional hoot of an owl outside were the only sounds. The whole place felt cozy, like a home away from home. I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But as the evening wore on, a subtle unease began to settle over me. Around midnight, as we were about to head to bed, there was a loud thud from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, but we both shrugged it off as the house settling. Tom made a joke about the house being too old for its own good, and we laughed it off. But then it happened again. This time, the thud was followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. I stood frozen, listening. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking across the floor upstairs. Tom didn't seem as bothered as I was, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He told me not to worry, that it was probably just the old wooden floors, but something about it didn't sit right with me. We decided to investigate. The cabin creaked as we ascended the stairs, each step echoing through the quiet house. The upstairs was small, with a single hallway leading to 2 rooms. We checked both rooms, but they were empty, nothing out of place. Still, the air felt thick, as if we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the noise. It was the way the atmosphere had changed. The house, which had seemed warm and welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive and cold. We returned downstairs, both a little on edge, but we tried to brush it off. We went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The sounds from upstairs continued every few minutes. A thud, then dragging footsteps. I kept telling myself it was just the house, but every time the noise echoed through the walls, I felt a little more unsettled. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the unmistakable sound of whispering, soft, hushed voices, like a conversation taking place right outside my door. My heart raced, and I held my breath, hoping it would stop. But the whispers only grew louder, coming closer. They weren't in any language I could understand, just low murmurs and strange, guttural sounds. I didn't know what to do. I tried to call out to Tom, but my voice caught in my throat. The whispers grew frantic, almost as if they were beckoning me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I finally gathered enough courage to peek outside the door. There was nothing. The hallway was empty, but the whispering was still there, surrounding me. I rushed downstairs to find Tom, but when I entered the living room, the house was eerily silent. Tom was sitting on the couch, staring at the fireplace with wide, unblinking eyes. His expression was vacant, his face pale. He didn't respond when I called his name. It was as if he couldn't hear me at all. Then I noticed something. His reflection in the window wasn't right. His image was distorted, like a shadow of himself, and the eyes staring back at me weren't his. I froze, my blood running cold. "Tom?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. I took a step closer, but before I could reach him, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, but no one was there. I turned back to Tom, but now his eyes were fixed on me, wide and unblinking. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening. The house seemed to be alive, its walls pulsing with energy, the very air vibrating with a malevolent force. Then, as if some invisible force had snapped, Tom's body jerked violently. His mouth opened wide, and an inhuman, guttural scream tore through the silence, echoing off the wall. His face twisted into an expression of pure agony, and his eyes rolled back to his head. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The room felt suffocating, as if the very air was closing in on me. The whispering reached a deafening crescendo, and I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Suddenly, everything went silent. The lights flickered, then went out. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. I ran toward the door, but as I touched the handle, I froze. Behind me, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, gaunt, and covered in shadow. Its face was pale, featureless, but its eyes, those eyes glowed with an unnatural, malicious light. I couldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and everything went black. When I woke up, it was daylight. I was outside the cabin, lying on the ground, my body bruised and battered. The cabin was gone, reduced to nothing but rubble. There were no signs of Tom, no trace of the horrors that had happened there. It was as if the cabin had never existed. I've tried to tell people what happened, but no one believes me. They think I'm crazy, that I hallucinated it. But I know what I saw. I know what happened that night. And I know that whatever was in that cabin, whatever took Tom, hasn't gone away. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again. And I know that whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. It was late October when I moved into the old house on the edge of town. I had been looking for a place to escape the noise and stress of the city. And this house, though a little rundown, felt like the perfect place to start fresh. The price was ridiculously, but the realtor assured me that the house was simply old, not haunted. I wasn't superstitious, so I didn't think much of it. The first few days were peaceful. The house was larger than I expected, with old hardwood floors that creaked underfoot and tall windows that let in streams of warm sunlight. The town itself was quiet, almost too quiet, but I liked the solitude. The first sign something was wrong came on the third night. I was alone in the living room, unpacking some boxes, when I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from upstairs. It wasn't the wind, not like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like someone was walking around, tapping their fingers on the walls. I tried to dismiss it as old pipes, the house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The tapping didn't stop. Every night at the same time, the sounds would return, tapping, dragging, something scraping against the wall. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was nothing. The house was old, after all. On the fourth night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I ascended. The air felt colder as I reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and oppressive. I approached the first door on the left. It was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a chill rush over me. The room was empty, Nothing but dust-covered furniture and a small window overlooking the yard. But there was something wrong. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, as if it had been trapped there for years. And then I saw it, a faint outline on the wall, barely visible, like something had been pressed against the paint for a long time, leaving an imprint. I reached out to touch it, but before I could, I heard the sound again, the tapping, closer now, right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was still empty, the silence suffocating. My heart raced as I backed out of the room, the door creaking shut behind me. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. The noises continued, growing louder with each passing hour. The tapping became more frantic, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I tried to block it out, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't. I was trapped in that house, unable to escape the growing dread that seemed to seep through the walls. The following evening, I decided to take a closer look. I went back upstairs and into the room with the strange outline on the wall. This time, I brought a small mirror, hoping to use it to check for any signs of movement or shadows in the room. As I held the mirror up to the wall, something caught my eye. A small, faded word, barely visible beneath the layers of dust and paint. "Help!" The word sent a chill through my spine. I ran my fingers over it, the letters feeling cold and almost alive. The tapping started again, louder this time, almost frantic. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but nothing was there. No shadows, no figures, just the oppressive darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted downstairs, grabbing my phone and calling the realtor. I needed answers. The woman on the other end of the line was calm, too calm, as if she already knew what I was going to ask. "It's not the house," she said softly. "It's the land. It's always been this way." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "And there's a reason the house was abandoned for so long," she explained. "The previous owners, they didn't last. None of them. It drives people mad. The isolation, the whispering, the tapping. It's never quiet here, not for long. You're not the first to hear it." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What's here? What's causing the sounds?" She hesitated. "It's the spirits, the ones who were buried on the land. They never left." I hung up, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But as the night dragged on, I started to question whether I was going insane. The tapping never stopped. In fact, it only got worse. It was now accompanied by whispers, low, unintelligible voices coming from the walls themselves. I could feel them, feel their presence around me, like they were reaching out, desperate for something. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, trying to find the source of the noise. As I moved through the hallway, I noticed something strange, a door at the end of the corridor that I hadn't seen before. It was old, its paint chipped and cracked, but it didn't look like any other door in the house. It was hidden, almost as if someone had deliberately tried to conceal it. My curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door, and as my hand touched the handle, the air grew cold again, a heavy, suffocating feeling pressing in on me. The tapping stopped, replaced by a single sharp knock from the other side of the door. My heart raced as I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The walls were lined with old, rotting shelves, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. But in the center of the room, under a thin sheet of dust, was a large wooden box. It looked old, centuries old, with strange markings carved into its surface. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it. I didn't know what possessed me to open it, but I did. Inside, there was nothing but a small, tarnished mirror, exactly like the one I had used upstairs. And on the back of the mirror, etched in what looked like blood, was the same word I had seen on the wall: "Help!" A sudden, intense force slammed the door shut behind me, trapping me in the room. The whispers were louder now. No longer whispers, but frantic, panicked voices. They were screaming at me, begging for release, for help. My mind reeled, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with desperation. And then I saw them. Figures, pale, translucent, twisted figures, their eyes hollow and their faces contorted in agony. They reached out toward me, their bony hands grasping for my throat, their mouths open in silent screams. I could feel their cold touch, their fingers brushing against my skin. The last thing I remember is the sound of my own scream, dragged into the darkness with them. The house was empty when they found me the next morning. I had disappeared without a trace. The neighbors say they hear the tapping and whispering at night, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, they swear they can hear someone screaming, but no one has dared to live there since. It was a cold autumn evening when I moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town. The price was right, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. I had been through a lot in the past few months, lost my job, my relationship, and a sense of purpose. So, when the opportunity arose to escape to this quiet, rural area, I took it. The house was remote, surrounded by dense woods and rolling fields. It felt like the perfect place to get away from it. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time cleaning up the house, unpacking boxes, and exploring the land. The house itself was old, a two-story structure with creaking floors, crooked walls, and an odd smell that seemed to come from the foundation. But it had character, and that's what I liked about it. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the isolation was both comforting and unnerving it. I kept telling myself it was exactly what I needed to start over. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things happening. It started with small, unexplainable noises, creaking floors at night, objects slightly out of place, and the occasional door that would open on its own. I tried to chalk it up to the house's age, to the wind rattling the windows or the shifting of old wood. But then, on the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking down the hallway outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. My heart raced as I listened to the footsteps approach. Whoever or whatever it was getting closer. The steps stopped just outside my door, and for a long, agonizing moment, everything was silent. I forced myself to get up, my legs shaking, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. No one was there, but the air was cold, colder than it should have been for a house that had been warm just moments before. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe I had been dreaming. But as the days went by, the occurrences grew more frequent and more intense. I would find objects move, things that I was certain I had left in one place, now in a completely different spot. The footsteps continued, always at night, always when I was alone. And then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They were barely audible, like a breeze brushing past your ear, but they were unmistakable. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way downstairs to the basement, where I'd heard strange sounds before. The air down there was thick, and the light flickered as I stepped into the room. There was an old, rusty furnace in the corner, and a pile of wooden crates stacked high against the far wall. As I moved closer to the crates, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The floor was stained, dark patches of what looked like old, dried blood. My stomach churned. The stain to the back of the basement, where there was a door, a small, narrow door that had been concealed behind the crates. I had never noticed it, and something told me I wasn't supposed to, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved the crates aside and opened the door. It creaked loudly, revealing a small, dark room beyond. As I stepped inside, the air grew even colder, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The room was empty, save for a single old rocking chair in the center. The chair moved slightly as if someone had just gotten up from it. I backed out of the room quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut, but the whispering didn't stop. It followed me up the stairs, echoed through the halls, and grew louder with each step I took. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers continued, louder than ever, filling every corner of the house. I felt like I was being suffocated by them. They were no longer just whispered. They were words, clear and unmistakable. I could hear them now, calling my name. "Help us," they pleaded. "Get out!" It was as if the house itself was alive, trying to warn me. But it wasn't just the whispers. I began to see things. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, flickering just out of reach. At night, I would hear the sound of the rocking chair again, creaking softly in the distance, though I knew no one was there to sit in it. And then, one evening, while I was sitting in the living room, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting it, and the area around the house was so remote that I rarely saw visitors. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just a small, weathered envelope sitting on the porch. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I opened it. Inside was a single, handwritten note. "You should have never come here." I felt a chill run down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around, but the house was silent. Too silent. The whispers had stopped, but something was wrong. The air had shifted. The warmth that had once filled the house was gone, replaced by an oppressive cold. I could feel eyes on me, watching me from every corner, every shadow. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it, the sound of the rocking, creaking slowly in the distance. I ran outside, terrified, my heart racing. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, I looked back to see the window on the second floor, the one I had never paid much attention to. And there, standing in the window, was a figure, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I didn't wait to see more. I ran to my car, threw open the door, and sped away, not daring to look back. It's been weeks since I left that house. I couldn't bring myself to go back, to even drive by the property. I've heard rumors about the farmhouse, about the things that happened there, about the people who disappeared. The house, they say, is cursed, haunted by the souls of those who died there. No one has lived in it for years, and sometimes when the night is still and quiet, I can still hear the creaking of a rocking chair in the distance. But I will never go back, because I know now, the house never truly lets go. It calls to you, drags you back in, and once you've heard its whispers, you can never escape. I had always been a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in things like ghosts or supernatural events, but that all changed the night I moved into the old Victorian house on Ashwood Street. I had just started a new job in the city, and I needed a place to stay. The house was beautiful, if not a little run down. It had history, more than 100 years old, and the owner, an elderly woman, seemed eager to get rid of it. The rent was cheap, and I needed a place fast. From the outside, it looked like something out of a storybook, tall, with a steep roof, intricate woodwork, and windows that stretched from the ground to the second floor. The kind of house you see in movies, old but full of charm. But something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as soon as I stepped inside, a sense of unease settled over me. The house was cold, even though the heat was running. I figured it was just because it had been unoccupied for a while. The woman had told me the house was well loved over the years, and it certainly showed. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the floorboards creaked, and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. But it was still livable. I could make it work. The first night was peaceful, but that didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. They were coming from upstairs, from the second floor. I tried to ignore it at first. Old houses make noises, right? The wind, the house settling, maybe even animals moving around in the walls. But this was different. The steps were too distinct, too purposeful, as if someone was walking through the house, unaware of my presence. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The steps stopped just outside my door, and then came a soft knock. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then the door slowly creaked open, just enough for a sliver of darkness to fill the room. I could feel the presence, something unseen standing in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the blackness. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I couldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating. The door shut quietly and the footsteps resumed, moving away down the hallway. I stayed frozen, too terrified to make a sound. What was happening? Was I dreaming? But it felt so real, so terrifyingly real. The next morning, I tried to dismiss the incident as a trick of the mind. I hadn't been sleeping well, and maybe the house had some old creaky noises. But when I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There, just outside my door, was a small smear of something dark on the floor. It looked like blood. I was too shaken to think straight, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a rodent had gotten into the house and left a mess. But as I continued through the house, I found more strange things. Small objects out of place, doors that had been shut the night before now standing ajar. It was as if something was trying to get my attention, something watching, waiting. The following night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stand the suspense any longer. Armed with only a flashlight and my nerve, I slowly made my way up to the second floor. The house was deathly silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I walked down the hallway, past several rooms, until I reached the last door at the end. It was closed, but I couldn't resist opening it. Inside, there was nothing but an old rocking chair in the corner, its surface covered in dust. It looked ordinary enough, but the moment I stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I approached the chair, hesitating for a moment before touching it. That's when I saw it. A series of words scrawled in chalk on the floor just beneath the chair. They were faded, almost illegible, but I could make out the word leave. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the chair and the words. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed toward the door. But before I could open it, I heard it. A soft, high-pitched whisper. It was coming from the corner of the room, from the chair. I turned, and the chair began to rock on its own. I didn't wait to see. I rushed out of the room and down the stairs, my heart racing. The air seemed to press in on me, the silence overwhelming, broken only by the sound of the rocking chair creaking in the distance. For the next few days, the activity in the house intensified. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps became more frequent, and I began to feel a presence following me around. I could hear someone breathing in the room with me, feel the pressure of unseen eyes on my back. The house seemed to be alive with malevolent force that I couldn't escape. Then, one night, after weeks of torment, I had had enough. I called the elderly woman who owned the house, desperate for answers. When she answered, her voice was strained, almost sad. Is it happening again? She asked, as if she had known all along. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What is this? What's going on? She sighed heavily. It's the house. It's cursed. It was built on land where something terrible happened many years ago. People died. People who never left. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What do you mean they never left? The souls that died here, they linger. They won't let go. The house, it feeds on fear. It gets stronger the more afraid you are. I felt my hands tremble. So, what do I do? Do I get rid of it? You can't, it said softly. It has you now. Once it chooses you, there's no escape. I didn't sleep that. I couldn't. The whispers were back, louder than ever, filling every room of the house. The footsteps echoed through the halls, and the rocking chair rocked incessantly. It was only then that I truly understood what the woman had meant. I had become part of the house, part of its history, trapped in the never-ending cycle of torment. The next morning, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I packed my things, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. But as I walked to the door, I heard the whisper again, right behind me, like a breath on my neck. Leave, it said, barely audible, but it was too late. The door wouldn't open. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped inside, and the rocking chair continued to creak in the distance, as if to remind me that I would never escape. The house had claimed me, and it always would. The police found the house empty the next day. No one ever heard from me again. But sometimes, if you pass by the old Victorian on Ashwood Street, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps, or maybe, if you're unlucky enough, the rocking chair creaking in the dead of night. I had always been drawn to the idea of living in an old, remote cabin. It sounded peaceful, the perfect escape from the stress of modern life. So, when I found a listing for a small, rustic cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. It was everything I wanted: secluded, isolated, surrounded by nature. The price was far cheaper than I expected, and the owner was eager to sell, which should have been a warning sign. But I didn't think too much about it at the time. I arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the sun is low in the sky and the air feels like it could cut through you. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, passing through miles of dense forest. When I finally arrived, the place looked exactly as I had imagined. Old, weathered wood, ivy creeping up the sides, and a thick blanket of fallen leaves covering the ground. It had a certain charm, though I could feel a strange energy surrounding it, like the land itself was holding its breath. I wasn't alone. The owner, an older man with a stoic expression, handed me the keys and gave me a brief tour. His eyes never met mine for long, and his voice was quiet, almost as if he didn't want to be heard. He mentioned the cabin had been in his family for generations, but he didn't go into any more detail. I tried not to let the awkward silence unsettle me, and when he left, I was alone. That night, I settled in by the fireplace, content in my solitude. The house creaked with the wind, the floors groaned underfoot, and the occasional animal sound echoed from the woods outside. It was all perfectly normal for an old cabin in the woods. But as the night deepened, I began to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the room when there was no one there. But as I continued to sit in front of the fire, the feeling grew stronger. The house was watching. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or my imagination. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping on the window. I froze, heart pounding. The sound was so light, almost like a whisper against the glass. Hesitant, I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer outside. There was nothing there, just the dark expanse of trees and the moon casting a pale glow over the landscape. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off and returned to my seat by the fire. Then it happened again, this time louder, more insistent. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I turned to the window again. But this time, I saw something. A figure standing just outside the cabin, staring in through the glass. It was a man, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood, his hands pressed against the window. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, my mind racing. Who was that? How had he gotten there without me hearing him? I rushed to lock the doors and turned off the lights, sitting in the dark, trying to calm my breathing. I thought I had imagined, but the tapping continued, now coming from multiple points around the cabin. I felt trapped, surrounded by unseen forces, and then came the whisper, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I had no choice but to grab my things and leave. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I dashed to my car, not daring to look back at the cabin, and sped down the winding road. But the next morning, I was back. I couldn't explain it, but there was something inside me, something compelling me to return. Maybe I had been scared by my imagination. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for everything that had happened. So I went back to the cabin, determined to face whatever was haunting me. The first few hours were quiet, too quiet. I spent my time unpacking and organizing, trying to distract myself from the eerie feeling that had settled over me. But as dusk fell, the atmosphere shifted again. The house seemed to groan with every breath of wind, and the temperature dropped dramatically. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from upstairs. Heavy, dragging steps, as if someone or something was moving through the darkened rooms above me. I froze, my body rigid with fear. I knew no one else was. The house was, but still the steps continued, coming closer. I didn't move, too terrified to make a sound. The footsteps stopped just above me, and for a long moment, there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and then the door to the attic creaked open. I could hear breathing, slow and labored, coming from the attic. I didn't know if it was a person or something else, but I couldn't take it any. I bolted from the cabin, running into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of footsteps following me, getting closer with each step, echoed in my mind. I didn't look back until I reached the road, but when I did, I saw it, just standing at the edge of the woods, the same figure from the night before, watching me with hollow eyes. I got in my car and drove as fast as I could, not caring about the road or what was behind me. When I finally reached the nearest town, I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't know what was happening at that cabin, but I knew I couldn't go back. The man who had sold it to me had never mentioned anything about what lived there, and I wasn't sure if he even knew. I later found out from a local historian that the cabin had been built on land once owned by a family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. They said their spirits never left. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear the sound of dragging footsteps following me. No matter where I go, and no matter how fast I run, I can never escape the feeling that something or someone is always watching from just beyond the trees. I had always thought that the quiet, secluded life would be peaceful. I grew up in a big city, constantly surrounded by noise, people, and chaos. When I found a small cottage-style home on the outskirts of town, I thought it was the perfect escape. The house was located deep in a wooded area, far from any neighbors, and the peace of nature was exactly what I needed. The price was right, too. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawkins, was anxious to sell. She had lived there alone for years, but claimed she had become too frail to maintain the property. When I moved in, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the birds sang in the morning, and the solitude was a welcome change from the hectic life I had left behind. The house itself was charming, small but cozy, with creaky wooden floors, an old fireplace, and windows that overlooked the dense forest. It felt like a place where time had slowed down, but it didn't take long for things to start feeling strange. It began with the little thing, objects out of place, lights flickering at odd hours, and the constant feeling of being watched. I dismissed it as just the quirks of an old house. After all, it was so remote, and the weather in the area could sometimes cause odd electrical issues. But then, I started hearing footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from the attic. I would be in the kitchen or reading in the living room, and I'd hear slow, careful steps above me. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling, but the more it happened, the less certain I became. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I was sitting in front of the fireplace when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they didn't stop. I felt a chill run through me as the sound grew louder, as though someone or something was pacing back and forth in the attic above me. My heart raced as I tried to reason with it. It was an old house after all. The attic was full of dust, old furniture, and the remnants of Mrs. Hawkins' belongings. Maybe it was just a rat or some other animal scurrying around. But when I ventured upstairs to check, I found nothing. No signs of any animals, no loose floorboards, nothing that could explain the sound. The attic was empty, save for a few dusty trunks and cobweb. I told myself I was overthinking and decided to go to bed. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering, faint, barely audible, but it grew clearer as I listened. It sounded like a woman's voice, low, almost a chant. I froze, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls, from all around me. Panic gripped as I lay there in the dark, my breath shallow. I wanted to turn on the light, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Then, the whispers stopped, replaced by the distinct sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my room. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I mustered the courage to get up and check. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, wondering if I had imagined it. But the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, on the floor outside my bedroom, was a small, delicate footprint. It was covered in dust, but it was unmistakable, small, pale, and with an almost skeletal quality. The footprint seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if someone had stepped lightly through the house in the dead of night. That was when I started to learn about the houses. I spoke to the townspeople, and they told me the same thing. Mrs. Hawkins had inherited the house from her mother, who had lived there alone for most of her life. But the real story went back even further. The house had once belonged to a family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the 1920s. They were never found, and no one knew what had happened. The family's disappearance was one of the most talked about mysteries in the area, but no one could ever explain it. Some locals believed the house was cursed. They said the family who had vanished had angered something in the woods, the very land the house was built on. There were whispers of strange rituals, of things that weren't human, and of dark forces that could never be truly escaped. Mrs. Hawkins, they said, had been the last surviving member of that family, and now the house had chosen me. I tried to dismiss it as superstition, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, I decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the footsteps, the growing sense of dread that had been creeping up on me every night. I packed a bag, ready to leave the house behind, but when I went to the door, I found it locked. I couldn't open it. The door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. I turned to the windows, but they too were locked, the glass cold and unyielding. Panic began to set in as I realized I was trapped. I ran from room to room, trying every window, every door, but they were all sealed tight. It was as if the house itself had decided I wasn't going anywhere. Then I heard the footsteps again, slow and methodical, coming from the stairs. The whispering began, faint at first, then growing louder, until it was all I could hear. I looked up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, at the top of the stairs, stood a figure, a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to be frozen, a silent scream. She was looking directly at me, her face twisted in a horrible expression of anguish. I couldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on hers as she slowly began to descend the stairs. Each step was deliberate, each movement slower than the last. I could feel the air grow colder, the room closing in around me. Just as she reached the bottom step, I heard the sound of the door unlocking behind me. I didn't question it. I ran. I bolted out of the house, not daring to look back. The door slammed shut behind me and the house was silent. I never went back. I left the town and never returned. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers, faint but clear, and I can feel the weight of that cold, dead stare following me wherever I go. The house is still there, abandoned now, just as it was when I left. No one else has dared to live there since, and I don't think anyone ever will. There's something in those walls, something that lingers long after the living have gone, and I fear that one day, when I least expect it, it will come for me. I had always been the curious type, the kind of person who would wander into places others would avoid. When I heard about an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. The stories surrounding the place were enough to make anyone shiver. Rumors of cruel experiments, patients who had never been released, and strange sounds echoing through the halls at night. But for me, it sounded like the perfect place to explore, to uncover secrets that had been buried for decades. The hospital had been shut down years ago after a series of scandals and mysterious deaths. Most of the building had fallen into disrepair, its windows shattered, and its doors hanging off their hinges. The local authorities had long since abandoned it, leaving it to rot in silence. The perfect breeding ground for stories, and the perfect location for someone like me, eager to get inside and see what others dared not. I managed to get through a broken fence and into the overgrown grounds. The building loomed in front of me, its dark silhouette cutting into the gray sky. My heart raced with anticipation and a tinge of fear. I had no idea what I was walking into, but the thrill of the unknown kept me going. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floors creaked under every step. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of something dripping, perhaps water leak from the roof, or maybe something else. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The hospital was like a mausoleum, the silence oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. I walked through the halls, snapping photos, trying to capture the decay and the strange beauty of the place. But as I moved deeper into the building, I began to notice something unsettling. The rooms, most of them were empty, save for broken furniture and scattered papers, seemed to be arranged in a way that didn't make sense, like the walls were closing in on me. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something that wasn't quite right. I reached the end of a long corridor and found a staircase leading down into the basement. The air down there was even heavier, thick with a stale smell that made my stomach turn. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. The basement was darker than I could have imagined, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. It revealed rows of old filing cabinets, their drawers half open, as though someone had hastily gone through them. As I moved further into the basement, I heard something. It was a faint noise at first, like a low hum or whispering. It was coming from deeper within the room, from behind a door I hadn't noticed before. The door was old and rusted, but it seemed to beckon me, as though it had been waiting for me to find it. I approached the door cautiously and pushed it open, my flashlight flickering in the dark. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the building. It was clean, pristine even, but the walls were lined with strange, old machines. Machines that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, not in an abandoned hospital. And in the center of the room, there was a bed. A single bed with straps attached to the sides. But it wasn't the machines or the bed that made my skin crawl. It was the thing sitting in the corner, obscured in shadows. At first I thought it was just an illusion, some trick of the light. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a person, a woman, her eyes wide open, staring directly at me. Her hair was wild and matted, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her clothes were tattered, barely clinging to her frail body. But what really chilled me is the way she was sitting, hunched over, her fingers twitching erratically, as if they were trying to move but couldn't. I froze, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to run, but something held me there. Her gaze seemed to lock onto mine, and I could feel her presence like a weight on my chest. She was trying to communicate, but no words came, just a low, guttural sound, like she was trying to speak but couldn't quite manage it. Then, as if in a trance, she began to move, slowly at first, like a puppet with broken strings, her limbs jerking unnaturally. She crawled toward me, her eyes never leaving mine. A voice, faint and distorted, echoed in my mind. Get out! I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my body frozen in place as she continued to crawl toward me, dragging herself across the floor with jerky, violent movement. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling, and I knew I had to leave. Now I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear her behind me, her movements getting faster, her breathing heavier. I could feel her closing in like a presence that would consume me if I let it. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, up the stairs, down the hallway, and out of the building. When I finally burst through the front doors and into the open air, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was safely away from the hospital grounds. I knew deep down that whatever was inside that building wasn't meant to be found, and yet it had called to me. It had lured me in. The authorities never found anything when they went to investigate the building. No records of a woman matching her description. No explanation for the strange machines or the pristine room in the basement. I couldn't bring myself to return, and over time, the memory of that place began to fade, but the terror never left me. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear a voice in my mind whispering, "Get out." It's a warning, I can't escape it. I don't know if what I saw in that hospital was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I will never go near that place again. Something was wrong with that building, something that shouldn't have been disturbed, and I fear that whatever is still there, lurking in the shadows, will never let me forget. I had always been skeptical about ghost stories. I grew up in a family that didn't believe in the supernatural. My parents were practical, down-to-earth people, and they raised me to be the same. But that all changed the night I stayed at my grandmother's old house. Grandma had lived in a large, creaky farmhouse on the outskirts of town for as long as I could remember. I used to visit her every summer, but after she passed away, the house had been left empty. I was an adult by then. When I heard that the house was up for sale, I thought it might be nice to spend one last night there, to relive some childhood memories before it was sold to strangers. I drove out there alone one evening, the sun setting behind me as I pulled up the long driveway. The house looked just as I remembered it, old, with ivy creeping up the walls, and a weathered front porch that seemed to sag under the weight of time. But as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air inside was heavy, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years. Dust covered every surface, and the floorboards creaked with every step I took. But there was something else too, a strange, unsettling energy that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the house, it was the feeling that something or someone was still here. I shrugged it off as nerves and went about exploring the house. I walked through the rooms, looking at old photographs on the walls and the furniture Grandma had kept for decades. It felt almost like a museum of her life, a place frozen in time. As I wandered through the hallway, I came to a door that I had never seen open before. It was a small room tucked away at the end of the hall, a place I had never been allowed to enter as a child. The door was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the best of me. I pushed it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air was colder here, and the room felt oddly empty, even though there was an old rocking chair in the corner and a small table covered in dust. On the walls were faded portraits, photographs of family members I didn't recognize. And there, in the center of the room, was a large mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished with age. I walked closer to the mirror, staring at my reflection. But something was wrong. My reflection didn't seem to match my mood. I tilted my head, and for a brief moment, my reflection stayed still, staring back at me with an expression that wasn't mine. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly stepped away, but the reflection didn't move with me. It stayed in place, frozen. I turned around and left the room, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I decided to leave the house for a bit and take a walk outside, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The porch light was flickering, and there was an odd smell in the air, something like old wood and decay. I looked around, but the only movement I saw was the sway of the trees in the wind. Yet, deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was watching me from the house. I spent the rest of the night trying to distract myself, but the unease only grew. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the house, so I set up camp outside in my car, hoping to sleep through the night. But as I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, I heard a soft scratching sound on the car window. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when I opened my eyes, I saw a figure standing just outside the car. A woman dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair long and unkempt, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and she was staring directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear as she slowly reached up to the window, her fingers brushing the glass. The coldness of her touch seemed to seep through, chilling me to my core. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished into the night. I sat there in shock, my heart racing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I didn't know how long I stayed in that car, but eventually I managed to gather the courage to get out. I ran back to the house, slammed the door behind me, and locked every window and door. But the feeling of dread was suffocating. I didn't dare go back to sleep. Instead, I spent the night pacing the rooms, trying to shake the terrifying image of that woman from my mind. But as the night dragged on, the noises in the house grew louder. Scratches on the walls, whispers from the corners of the room, the sound of footsteps from upstairs. It felt as if the house was alive, watching me, waiting for something. At dawn, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my things and fled the house. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. The house stood there, silent and still, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching me leave. I haven't been back since. The house was sold shortly after, and I never heard anything about the new owners. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see that woman's pale face, staring at me from the darkness. I don't know what she wanted or why she was there, but I'll never forget the fear I felt in that moment. There are some places that hold on to memories, and some things that never let go. That house and the woman in the nightgown will stay with me for as long as I... It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of everyday life and spend a few quiet days in nature. My friends and I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just the sound of the trees swaying in the wind and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I thought it would be the perfect place to relax and unwind. The cabin itself was old, weathered by years of neglect, but it had a charm to it. A stone fireplace in the living room, a wooden porch that overlooked a small creek, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Sarah, and 2 other close friends, Jake and Emily. We were all in our mid-20s, used to spending weekends in places like this, and none of us thought twice about being so far from the nearest town. The first night was peaceful. We gathered around the fireplace, drank a few beers, told stories, and laughed. There was nothing unusual about the place, except for the eerie quiet that seemed to settle over the woods once the sun went down. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was just the isolation. The next morning, we went for a hike, exploring the trails that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the ground soft beneath our boots. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, we began to notice something strange. Small, twisted trees with branches that seemed to curl unnaturally. The path we were following had begun to grow narrower, as if the forest itself was closing in on us. At some point, we lost track of the trail. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching long across the ground, and the air felt heavier. We tried retracing our steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest seemed to be rearranging itself, making it impossible to find our way back to the cabin. That's when we heard it, a soft whispering sound, almost like a breeze, but with a strange, rhythmic quality. It seemed to come from every direction, surrounding us. I turned to Sarah, my heart racing, and saw the fear in her eyes. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, Jake and Emily started moving faster, almost as if they were being pulled in a certain direction. "Let's just follow the sound," Jake said, though his voice was strained as if he wasn't entirely sure of what he was saying. We had no choice but to follow them, though I had a sinking feeling in my gut. The whispering grew louder the further we went, until it felt like the forest itself was speaking, urging us onward. It didn't make sense, but we kept moving, desperate to find our way back to the cabin. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center, there was a stone circle, large rocks arranged in a perfect ring, their surfaces weathered by time. There was no explanation for it, no signs of human activity, no indication that anyone had been here recently. The silence that surrounded the clearing was deafening. That's when the whispering stopped. We stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. But then Emily screamed. We turned toward her, but before we could reach her, she collapsed to the ground, her eyes wide with terror. Her body twitched as though she were being pulled by invisible strings, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. I rushed to her side, trying to shake her awake, but it was as if she couldn't hear me. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I followed her gaze, my blood running cold. There, standing just beyond the stone circle, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and completely still. The figure was draped in dark, tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood. But what truly terrified me was the way it stood. It didn't move. It didn't even breathe. It was as if it was part of the forest itself, its presence blending with the shadows. Suddenly, Emily's body jerked upright, her head twisting in a way that wasn't humanly possible. She let out a horrified gasp, her eyes bulging as if she were about to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't take it any. Panic overtook me. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, pulling Sarah toward me. Jake was already backing away, his face pale with fear. As we turned to run, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The whispering. It was back, but now it was loud, screeching, twisting, and filling the air. It wasn't a breeze anymore. It was a voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the forest, speaking words that I couldn't understand but felt deep within my bones. We ran through the woods, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding. The forest seemed to close in on us, the trees reaching out with their gnarled branches, blocking our path. We were trapped. Somehow, we made it back to the cabin just as night fell. Emily had stopped twitching, her body limp and unresponsive, as though she were in some sort of trance. I tried to shake her awake, but she didn't respond. It was as if her mind had been taken from her. That night we heard things that weren't there, scratching at the windows, low guttural growls coming from the woods, and worst of all, the whispering, still lingering in the air, like a constant presence. We couldn't stay in the cabin any longer, but when we tried to leave the next morning, the path back to the road was gone. The woods had shifted overnight, leaving us completely lost. For days, we wandered in circles, hoping to find an exit, but no matter how far we walked, we couldn't escape. It was as if the forest was alive, and it was keeping us. And all the while, Emily, she never woke up. Her eyes were vacant, her body. She was still with us, but she was no longer the person. We never found our way out. The last thing I remember was walking through the trees, the whispering growing louder and louder until it swallowed everything. And then there was nothing, only darkness. I don't know how long I've been here, or if I'm even still alive, but every now and then, I hear the whispers again, and I know the forest is calling me, and I know it's waiting for the rest of us to join it. The old house at the edge of town had always intrigued me. I'd passed it countless times, but I'd never thought much about it. It was just an abandoned house, one of many that seemed to dot the outskirts of the city. But one evening, as I walked home from the bus stop, something about it seemed different. The windows, once covered in dirt and grime, were now clear. The door, which had been hanging off its hinges for years, was shut tight. The house almost seemed alive. I couldn't resist. The curiosity gnawed at me, urging me to explore. Maybe it was the stillness of the evening, or the fact that I'd never noticed the house looking so present before. Whatever it was, I found myself walking toward it, feeling an odd pull in the pit of my stomach. The door creaked open without resistance, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. The air inside smelled stale, like old wood and dust. I stepped in, the floorboards beneath my feet echoing in the silence. The house was empty, at least it seemed that way at first. There were no signs of life, no furniture, just bare walls and the faint smell of decay. But then, I heard it, a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible sound. as though someone were speaking just out of earshot. It sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but I was sure I had heard something. I moved cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust. As I ventured deeper into the house, the whispering grew louder. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, coaxing me deeper into the house. I reached a hallway lined with doors, most of which were shut tight, but one of them, the last door at the end of the hall, was slightly ajar. Without thinking, I pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, save for the faint light spilling in through a cracked window. It was a bedroom, though it didn't look like any bedroom I'd ever seen. The bed was covered in sheets that were yellowed with age, and there was an old rocking chair in the corner, its wooden frame cracked and splintered. But it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the mirror. Hanging on the wall opposite the bed was an old, ornate mirror, the frame tarnished with age. At first I didn't think much of it, but as I looked into the reflection, I felt a sudden unsettling sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck. The reflection wasn't right. I wasn't alone in the room. A figure stood behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just me and the silence. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. It was a woman, tall and thin, dressed in a tattered white gown. Her face was pale, her features indistinct, as though her image was barely holding together. She was staring at me, her eyes dark and hollow. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in the process. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman in the mirror didn't move. She just stood there, watching me, as though she had all the time in the world. A voice echoed in my mind, a whisper I could barely hear, but could feel deep inside me. Leave. I backed out of the room slowly, my feet dragging as being held down by some invisible force. When I reached the hallway, I turned to run, but the whispering was all around me. It was louder than before, rising to a cacophony of voices, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The house seemed to be alive, breathing with a presence that was far older and darker than anything I had ever known. I reached the door, only to find it wouldn't budge. The handle rattled in my hand, but the door refused to open. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and the temperature in the house plummeted. I could see my breath, clouding in front of me as the walls seemed to close in. I turned back toward the hallway, desperate to find another exit. But there, standing at the far end of the corridor, was the woman. She wasn't in the mirror anymore. She was standing in the flesh, her long, skeletal fingers reaching toward me. Her eyes were no longer hollow, they were full of rage, filled with something ancient and vengeful. Leave or stay forever. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, throwing myself against the door once more. This time it gave way and I stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see the woman watching me from one of the windows, but there was nothing. The house stood still and silent, as though it had never been anything more than an ordinary, abandoned place. I left that night, vowing never to return. But even now, every time I pass that house, I can't help but feel its presence, lingering in the corner of my mind. The whispering still follows me, like a shadow I can't escape. And sometimes in the stillness of the night, I can hear it again, calling out to me, leave or stay forever. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, throwing myself against the door once more. This time it gave way and I stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see the woman watching me from one of the windows, but there was nothing. The house stood still and silent, as though it had never been anything more than an ordinary, abandoned place. I left that night, vowing never to return. But even now, every time I pass that house, I can't help but feel its presence, lingering in the corner of my mind. The whispering still follows me, like a shadow I can't escape. And sometimes in the stillness of the night, I can hear it again, calling out to me, leave or stay forever.